Brother and his wife had me escorted out of my own building by security. They handed me a box of my things, changed the locks that same afternoon, and sent a company-wide email announcing my voluntary resignation. I still remember standing on the sidewalk in front of the place I'd spent 11 years building, holding a cardboard box with a dying fern on top, watching people I'd hired walk past the lobby windows without looking up. What they didn't know, what neither of them had bothered to find out, was that the building itself was in my name. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Lena, and I have been in the food business since I was 22 years old. Not the glamorous side of it, not the side you see on cooking shows with marble countertops and celebrity judges. I started at the real bottom, washing dishes at a diner off Route 9 in Columbus, Ohio, saving every dollar I could, eating instant noodles 4 nights a week because I had a number in my head and I wasn't going to stop until I hit it. My brother Marcus was 5 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one our parents pointed to. Good grades, scholarship to Ohio State. The kind of son who remembered to call on birthdays and showed up to family dinners in a pressed shirt. I was the one who dropped out of community college after 1 semester. The one who didn't have a plan. The one our mother used to call impulsive, with a kind of resigned love in her voice. What none of them understood was that my plan was just different from theirs. It didn't fit on a diploma. It didn't come with a title. When I was 26, I took out a small business loan for $40,000, which I combined with every cent I had in savings, and I opened a sandwich counter inside a shared commercial kitchen in the Short North neighborhood. 6 tables. A chalkboard menu. I made everything myself from 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then cleaned up and did the books until 7 at night. On weekends, I catered small events out of a secondhand van I bought for $3,200 and named Betty because she made a sound like an asthmatic seal every time she started up. I was not an overnight success. That first year, I lost money. The second year, I broke even. The third year, I made just enough profit to hire one part-time employee, a college student named Oscar, who showed up exactly on time every single day and never once complained, which made him the best employee I would ever have. By the time I was 30, I had my first real location, a storefront on High Street with actual interior walls and a commercial hood vent that worked without me banging it 3 times first. I called it Lena's Table, which in retrospect was probably a mistake from a branding standpoint because once I started opening other locations, the name didn't scale. But I was proud of it. It was honest. It said exactly what it was. By 34, I had 4 locations across Columbus. I had 17 full-time employees and another dozen part-time. I had a commissary kitchen I owned outright, a catering arm that did corporate events and private parties, and a small wholesale line selling our sauces and dressings to 3 local grocery chains. I had also, somewhere in there, stopped being the sister without a plan. That was around the time Marcus lost his job. He'd been in pharmaceutical sales for a decade. Good money, company car, expense account. Then his company restructured, his whole division got eliminated, and at 41, he found himself sitting in our parents' kitchen in Westerville with no job, a mortgage, and a wife named Petra who had expensive taste and a very particular idea of what their life was supposed to look like. I want to be fair here because I've spent a lot of time trying to be fair. Marcus was genuinely in pain. Losing a career you've built your identity around at 41 is not a small thing. When he called me and said he didn't know what to do, I believed him. When he asked if he could come in and learn the business from the ground up, I thought he meant it. I said yes without hesitating because he was my brother and because I thought maybe this was the version of us we were finally supposed to become. The 2 of them together, building something that would outlast us both. I brought him in as Director of Operations. It was a real title with real responsibilities. I walked him through every part of the business, the vendor relationships, the staffing schedules, the POS systems, the commissary workflow, the catering contracts. I paid him a salary that was more than fair, gave him a stake in the profits, and told him plainly that if he stuck with it, we could structure a real equity arrangement within 2 years. Petra started coming into the offices about 6 weeks after Marcus did. I don't know exactly when it shifted. I know it was gradual. She began sitting in on meetings she hadn't been invited to. She started offering opinions on marketing, on menu pricing, on how the website should look, on whether we should rebrand entirely and drop my name from the business. She had a business degree from a school I'd never heard of and a way of saying things that made it sound like whatever had existed before her arrival was charmingly amateur. Marcus never corrected her. He never said, "Petra, that's Lena's call." He just nodded and looked at his phone. I told myself to be patient. I told myself she was adjusting, that she was used to a certain kind of life, and this was a lot of change for both of them. I told myself it would settle. It did not settle. About 8 months in, Marcus came to me with a proposal. He'd been talking to a private investor, a friend of Petra's from some networking group she was involved with, who was interested in taking a stake in the business. The number they were discussing was significant, $250,000, which would fund a fifth and sixth location plus a full kitchen equipment upgrade at the commissary. Marcus presented it like he'd done me a favor just by finding it. I asked to see the terms. He said they were still informal, not worth putting on paper yet. I said I wanted them on paper before any conversation went further. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when we were kids, and I wouldn't go along with something. Half irritated, half surprised, like my having an opinion was an inconvenience. I declined the investor. I had my reasons, and they were sound. The equity percentage being discussed would have diluted my controlling interest, and the repayment structure had terms that made no sense for a business with our revenue model. I explained this calmly. I offered to share the financial projections that led me to that conclusion. Marcus and Petra had dinner at our parents' house that Sunday and apparently spent most of it explaining why I was difficult. The months that followed were a slow erosion. Marcus started making operational decisions without telling me. Small ones at first, changing a supplier, adjusting a scheduling policy, then larger ones. He signed a 2-year contract with a linen service I'd specifically decided against, locking us into pricing that was 15% over market rate. He offered a location manager a promotion and a raise that we hadn't discussed and that wasn't in the budget. When I found out and brought it up, he told me I was micromanaging, that he couldn't do his job if I was going to question every decision, that this was exactly the problem with how I ran things. I started sleeping badly. I started second-guessing myself in ways I never had before. I'd built this business decision by decision for 11 years, and suddenly I was spending my Sunday nights wondering if I was actually the problem. Looking back, I think that was the point. The meeting happened on a Tuesday in March. I know it was a Tuesday because I had a catering walkthrough scheduled for that afternoon at a law firm downtown, and I remember thinking about it while everything around me was coming apart. I arrived at our main office location, the one on Fifth Avenue that also housed our admin staff, and found the conference room already occupied. Marcus was there. Petra was there. And there were 2 other people I didn't recognize, a man in a very good suit who turned out to be an attorney, and a woman who introduced herself as a consultant Marcus had brought in to help with the transition. I asked what transition. Marcus didn't look at me when he spoke. He said that after a lot of thought and consultation, he and Petra had decided that the business needed new leadership. He said that my management style was creating a toxic environment. He used that exact phrase, toxic environment, and that several employees had expressed concerns. He said that effective immediately, he was assuming the role of CEO, and that my continued involvement in day-to-day operations was not going to be possible. The attorney slid a document across the table, a separation agreement, a number at the bottom, a buyout figure for my interest in the operations company that was insultingly low, below market, below any reasonable valuation I could have gotten from a first-year business student. I looked at the document. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Petra, who had her hands folded on the table and was watching me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy. I said, "You don't actually have the authority to do this." Marcus said that he'd had the operating agreement reviewed by counsel. He nodded toward the suited attorney. And that as director of operations with signatory rights on the business accounts, he had sufficient standing to make this change in leadership structure. He'd done his homework, I'll give him that. What he failed to do, what neither of them had apparently thought to do, was look at the actual ownership structure of the business, not the operating company, the underlying assets. Because Lena's Table LLC, the operating entity, was a tenant. The commissary kitchen, the Fifth Avenue office, the flagship location on High Street, those properties were owned by a separate holding company I'd established 6 years earlier on the advice of my accountant, a woman named Ruth, who had once told me, "Lena, separate your operations from your real estate because operations can be disrupted, but land just sits there and waits for you." I'd followed that advice. Every property the business used was leased from my holding company. I was the sole member. Marcus was staging a coup in a building he didn't own. I did not say any of this in the conference room. I looked at the separation agreement for another moment, then I looked up and said, "I'll need a few days to review this with my attorney." The suited man across the table said that the timeline was actually quite short, that they'd appreciate a response by end of week. I said, "I understand," picked up my bag and walked out. I went to the catering walkthrough. I don't know why. Maybe because it was on my calendar and I have never in my life stood up a client. I walked through a 32nd floor law firm conference room with a woman named Beverly who wanted heavy appetizers and an open bar for 60 people, and I gave her our standard proposal and told her we'd follow up by Thursday. And I was completely professional for 45 minutes while my hands were trembling in my coat pockets. Then I sat in my car in the parking garage and called Ruth. She listened to everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "They didn't check the deeds." I said, "No." She said, "Lena, they're operating in your buildings." I said, "I know." She said, "Okay, don't sign anything, don't respond to the attorney, come to my office tomorrow morning at 8 and bring everything." I spent that night at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee and every document I owned related to the business. Leases, the holding company formation papers, the property deeds, the operating agreement for Lena's Table LLC, which Marcus had apparently had reviewed but which, as I read it again, contained a clause I'd insisted on when I formed the company. Any change in management structure required written consent from the majority owner. I owned 68%. He hadn't checked that either. The next 2 weeks were the most methodical I have ever been in my life. Ruth connected me with a business attorney named Gregory, who was about 60 years old and had the energy of someone who found this kind of situation genuinely interesting. He reviewed everything and confirmed what I already knew. Marcus had no legal authority to remove me as majority owner. His assumption of the CEO role was not valid under the operating agreement. And as for the properties, as a tenant of my holding company, the operating business was subject to the lease terms I set. Gregory drafted a letter. It was 3 pages long and very calm and very precise, and it outlined, in detail, the specific ways in which Marcus and Petra's actions had violated the operating agreement, the fiduciary duties owed to me as majority owner, and potentially certain provisions of Ohio business law. It also noted, very calmly, that the leases on all 3 primary business locations were month to month, something Marcus could have verified if he'd ever actually read the lease agreements, and that as the sole member of the holding company, I retained the right to modify those terms. We sent the letter on a Thursday morning. Marcus called me that same afternoon. I didn't answer. He called 3 more times. Then Petra called twice. Then an unknown number called, which I assumed was the suited attorney. I texted Marcus one sentence, "Please communicate through counsel." He showed up at my apartment that evening. I watched through the peephole as he stood in my hallway for almost 4 minutes before leaving. I want to say I felt nothing, but that's not true. I felt something, not satisfaction exactly, more like grief with a clean edge to it, like knowing something was over and being okay with that. Gregory and the other attorney talked for most of the following week. I was told that Marcus's attorney, who had apparently also not reviewed the property situation in full, had some difficulty adjusting to the new information. There were calls, there were revised positions. There was a moment, which Gregory relayed to me with professional neutrality, where Marcus apparently became emotional and said that I was weaponizing my ownership to punish him. Gregory said he'd explain that ownership is not a weapon, it's just ownership. The final resolution took about 3 weeks to finalize. Marcus and Petra gave up any claim to a management role in the operating company. The lowball buyout offer they put on the table was never mentioned again. In exchange for their exiting cleanly, I agreed not to pursue a claim for the operational decisions Marcus had made without authorization, the overpriced linen contract, the unauthorized promotion, though I did require reimbursement for the difference in the linen pricing, which came out of the profit distributions he was owed. I also did not renew the lease on the office space where the whole thing had happened. I moved admin operations to the commissary building, renovated the Fifth Avenue space, and leased it to a physical therapy practice that has been a perfect tenant ever since. Marcus and I have not spoken about that period in any real way. We see each other at Christmas. Our mother, who I think understands more than she lets on, makes her honey-glazed ham and keeps conversation light. Marcus talks about a consulting project he's working on. I talk about the new location. We eat pie and leave without resolving anything, which is, I've come to understand, a kind of resolution in itself. The fifth and sixth locations did eventually open. I funded them myself, over 2 years without outside investors. Location 5 is in Dublin, Ohio, near a medical corridor that generates steady lunch traffic. Location 6 is in a mixed-use development in the short north, a 10-minute drive from the shared kitchen where I started with 6 tables and a chalkboard menu. I hired a real director of operations. Her name is Carmen. She came from a regional restaurant group with 12 years of experience, and she has never once tried to change the name on the door. Oscar, the college student who showed up exactly on time every single day, is now my commissary manager. He still doesn't complain about anything. I think about what my mother used to say about me: impulsive, no plan. And I understand now that what looked like no plan was actually a very long plan, one that just moved too slowly for people who wanted things to be legible right now. Every decision I made in those early years, including the ones that looked like stubbornness, including the ones that frustrated people who thought they knew better, they were part of something I was building. Not for anyone else. For me. The building is still in my name. I check the deeds every year, not because I'm worried, but because Ruth told me that's what you do when something is yours. You keep your hands on it. You don't let it get blurry. You know exactly what you own and exactly what it's worth, and you do not let anyone stand in a room and tell you otherwise. I am still after everything, Lena, and Lena's table is still mine. I used to think that being underestimated was the worst thing that could happen to you. Standing on that sidewalk with a cardboard box and a dying fern, watching the building I'd spent 11 years paying for through the lobby glass. I felt it in my chest like something physical, like a bruise that hadn't shown up on the skin yet. But I've had time to sit with it now, and I think I had it backwards. Being underestimated is only dangerous if you've also underestimated yourself. What Marcus and Petra never understood, what I don't think they were capable of understanding, is that the business wasn't something that happened to me. I built it. Every location, every lease, every vendor relationship, every conversation with Ruth about separating operations from real estate. Those weren't lucky guesses. They were choices I made deliberately over years because I'd learned early that the only thing standing between me and losing everything was knowing exactly what I owned and exactly what I wanted and exactly what it was worth. That's not a gift. That's a discipline. It's something you have to practice the same way you practice anything else, over and over until it becomes the way you naturally move through the world. I also think about the ethics of what Marcus did, and I do call it what it is, because softening the word doesn't make the thing smaller. He used my trust as a door. He walked through it, looked around at everything I'd built, and decided he was entitled to it. Petra reinforced that entitlement every day she sat in meetings she hadn't been invited to. Neither of them asked a hard question about whether what they were doing was right, because I think they convinced themselves that the end justified the means, that the business would be better under new management. Which is a very clean story to tell yourself when the thing you're actually doing is taking what belongs to someone else. I don't carry anger about it anymore. Not really. But I also don't pretend it was a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and choices have weight, and that weight lands somewhere eventually. What landed it was paperwork, which sounds anticlimactic, but it isn't. The deeds, the operating agreement, the lease terms, those documents existed because at some point, years before any of this happened, I had the discipline to sit down with Ruth and think 10 steps ahead. I was 28 years old and exhausted, and I really didn't want to spend a Saturday morning at an accountant's office talking about holding companies. But I did it anyway. Not because I was afraid of Marcus. I didn't even know what was coming, but because I'd learned that the difference between someone who survives a crisis and someone who doesn't is almost always something they did long before the crisis arrived. That's the part I want to hold on to. Not the resolution, not the moment when Gregory sent the letter and Marcus stopped calling. Those felt like relief, not victory. What I actually want to remember is the Saturday morning with Ruth. The decision made quietly without drama before anyone was watching. The boring, unglamorous act of protecting what I'd built. Not because I was afraid, but because I respected it enough to take it seriously. Lena's table is still mine, and I check the deeds every year.